Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another kids horror movie review. This movie came out in the year 2000. It was written by Richard Cordew and Rock LaFortune, based on a story by Robert Tennell, and the movie itself was also directed by Robert Tennell. And the film in question is Believe. Now, I can remember watching this movie maybe in the early 2010s, somewhere around there, on a network called Chiller. And back in the day, Chiller played a bunch of anthology horror shows like Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters, Beyond Belief Fact or Fiction, and also played kids' horror shows such as The Nightmare Room. So I frequented that network quite a bit. And as a matter of fact, right next to the Haunting Hour getting DVR'd from the Hub Network, I would DVR so many shows back then from the Chiller Network. And I think I DVR'd this one night because I looked back in the day on cable, you're allowed to browse through the shows and see what's coming up next way down in advance. This was, of course, pre-streaming and post-TV guides, really. So most people were just kind of browsing through like I was doing back in the day. And I saw that this movie starred Alicia Cuthbert, who I used to have a massive crush on around that time. So I really wanted to check this movie out just for her. And I remember watching and sitting through it and being kind of whatever with it. But given that it's been almost 10 years since I've last seen this film and I've came back to it, this honestly feels like a sympathetic ghost story that you would see in Are You Afraid of the Dark? Just pick any one. This feels right at home with it. Just put into a film and made 95 minutes long. So if you're a fan of Are You Afraid of the Dark, and specifically those sympathetic ghost stories, you'll feel right at home watching this movie. Honestly, if somebody told me that the creators of Are You Afraid of the Dark made this, I would believe it. And it's funny enough that the two leading stars are kind of associated with Are You Afraid of the Dark and even Goosebumps, but we'll get into that shortly. As an adult, being 10 years down the line since I first seen it, this film hasn't really held up for me, but I still think that it's overall a solid movie for what it is. I have only seen two films now by Robert Tennell. It's this movie and another movie I'm going to review sometime in the future called Frankenstein and Me, which ironically has a similar actor that you will see in this film as well. But that's beyond the point and for another day. And I noticed that I'm the only person on YouTube with a review of this film out there, which is kind of sad, but I also get it because just to track down a physical copy of this, it's really hard to find this movie. It looks like it's been out of print for many years, and people are asking like $20 to $30 online. If you're looking to watch this film for free, somebody ripped a copy on YouTube for you, so don't be hard-pressed to check it out or go buy it in that kind of way. Just go watch it for free and see how you feel about it. But with that out of the way, let's get into the plot overview of Believe without giving too much away. So the story starts off with this main character named Ben Stiles, who you might recognize, played by an actor known as Ricky Mabe. And Ricky Mabe, I think he played Clark, I think that's his name, in How to Kill a Monster. He also starred in Robert Tennell's other movie, Frankenstein and Me, from the 90s. And that movie, I think, aired on The Wonderful World of Disney at some point. So go figure there. And Ricky Mabe, I think that's his name. Yeah. He also starred in a later season episode from Are You Afraid of the Dark? And I think season 6 or 7. So Ricky Mabe is a Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark alum. Well, he plays in this movie, I think, like a 15-year-old kid. He's at a private boarding school in the beginning of the movie, and he's bringing these much younger boys into this gymnasium of sorts to kind of carry out a prank on them because I guess he's bored and he likes making up ghost stories. And he set up an elaborate puppet to kind of coincide with this legend that he's telling the boys, and he's making them really scared. And this, of course, comes to fruition, and the kids, of course, get scared by the ghost figure, while Ben himself is pretending to go along with the fake haunting of sorts. Well, the screaming and the commotion unfortunately gets the headmaster dean at their boarding school's attention, and he breaks up the boys fun, let's just say. And Ben gets brought into his office with the evidence in hand, and the headmaster kind of tells him, he's like, I was hoping that since you got expelled from your previous private school that you would do better here, but since you're up to no good, I have no choice but to expel you. And unfortunately, your parents are over in Europe right now on their work assignment, so I'm forced to kind of call you a plane so you can go stay with your grandfather for a bit. And once Ben hears this information onto him, he seems to be a little unfazed, because maybe at this point of the movie, because there's a lot of exposition that happens prior to the movie's timeline, unfortunately. You can tell that he has a history of being kicked out of schools, and he doesn't really care that much. And we get a glimpse of why that is when he gets on the phone to call his parents over in Europe, where he's like, hey, can you guys just come home and, maybe spend time with me and all that? And parents are like, we're busy, blah, 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 blah. So Ben kind of feels outcasted from his family, and you get this sense that he doesn't really feel like he belongs in his own family dynamic or structure, so to speak. So when he shipped it off out of his former boarding school to his grandfather's house, he gets picked up by a chauffeur at the airport, and the chauffeur is bringing him to this huge, lavish, private estate, I guess in this uphills of I guess Maine's backcountry, because it's out in the middle of nowhere, but there's a bunch of beautiful homes in the surrounding area. And his grandfather's mansion is said to be one of the biggest houses in the neighborhood. And there's a quite famous private school in the nearby area that he's going to be attending. So, unfortunately for Ben, he's not too close with his grandfather, and this is an awkward interaction when they first meet each other, I guess, or haven't seen each other in quite a long time. And the grandfather seems to be, at first fine with him being there, and says, hey, look, you're going to be going to school here. I just ask that you follow my rules, blah, 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 and is being really strict with Ben about that. And Ben is like, okay, I don't know what to make of this guy, but he's my grandfather, and I guess he's giving me a home to live in, and this is some sort of stability I've been kind of looking for. Well, as soon as Ben is thrusted into this house of sorts, he also meets this author guy who, for some reason, is in the movie and is hardly ever involved with anything, but he's kind of there to stay with his grandfather, to get some peace and quiet, and maybe do some research into building a fictional story for his next novel sorts. And he has a little pep talk with Ben, saying, why don't you put some of this stuff behind you, but also keep yourself intact in a little bit of ways. So Ben kind of takes that to heart. But when he does that, he's also thrusted into a situation where his former antics might start to intersect with real life phenomenon that he's going through. And Ben starts to hear wailing and screaming outside of his grandfather's estate. And unbeknownst to him, this place may or may not be haunted. And Ben, when he starts hearing these noises, he starts asking around the personnel that work on his grandfather's estate about it. This place is actually haunted. And some of the workers are, kind of apprehensive at first. And then it's only made worse when one night he thinks he hears the wailing and screaming and thinks that he sees a ghost of a woman out in the middle of his backyard going into the woods in the surrounding area. So he goes out to investigate, and in doing so, he bumps into this girl named Catherine, who is played by Alicia Cuthbert. And they two both kind of hit it off and form an immediate friendship in a shared phenomenon of listening to this moaning and wailing from this ghost. And they agree that maybe they should, hang out and investigate and see what's behind this phenomenon. So immediately, almost after that event, Ben is kind of thrusted into a situation where he has to kind of stick up for Catherine within his first few days at this new prep school that he goes to. And he notices that Catherine is getting bullied by these two big pricks who are basically making fun of her for being a quote-unquote orphan. So when Ben sticks up for her and sees that she's crying and she tries to go off and not say anything to him because I guess she wants her space, Ben starts to prod a little bit, and Catherine reveals that she lost her parents in a tragic car accident a year prior, And now she lives with her granddad, who lives in the house behind Ben's grandfather's estate. So Catherine immediately starts to pull at Ben's heartstrings, and Ben is like, you know what, Catherine, I really feel for you. And I have a history of being, quote unquote, a bad boy, and I know how to get back at these guys if you would let me help you. And Catherine agrees, and the two of them start to go on this mischief adventure for a little bit of the movie. But Ben, of course, keeps prodding at the workers, and the workers kind of confirm that this place might actually be haunted. And while Ben is trying to help his friend Catherine set up this elaborate prank in an undisclosed location, he's also prodding his grandfather about information about the ghost and if he knows anything. And the grandfather's like, don't bring it up. And he's acting really suspicious and weird about the whole thing, which makes him more off putting for him. But Ben has to, help Catherine. So he finds this abandoned house, I guess, on an adjacent property that his grandfather owns, and it's completely vacant. And they have decided to set up a bunch of pranks within the house so they can invite the bullies over and some peers to kind of ostracize the bullies in front of everyone and get back at them and make them look like a bunch of chumps. And we get through the whole montage of Ben and Catherine setting up these pranks in the house. And then we get to the point where they invite the bullies and their peers over to the house to enact the pranks. And it may or may not succeed for the two. And it goes off without a hitch. Well, after that point, Ben, feeling victorious, he goes back home, and his grandfather's like, where have you been? You've been really weird lately. And he's like, well, I made friends with this girl named Catherine. And his grandfather's like, whoa. You're talking about Catherine, so-and-so's granddaughter? Yeah, I don't want you to see her anymore. And that's that. If you don't want to listen to me, I'm going to have to find another arrangement for you. And Ben's like, all right, screw you, granddad. She's my friend. She needs me. I'm going to still hang out with her. So from this point on, the movie kind of shifts tone back to the ghost phenomenon that kind of kickstarted Ben and Catherine's relationship together, where they start to go to like public libraries and start to do more research into the events of the ghosts. And Ben, at some point, I don't really remember at what point of the movie he came across this information, but he notices that this spiritual writer, or I guess philosopher of sorts, you even call that a medium, whatever, she has written a book called Believe, and I don't know if it has anything to do with the title here, but she's holding a seminar that the two of them really want to go to get more information, possibly on how to communicate with this dead woman's ghost that they both claim to have seen, heard, and kind of felt the presence of. Well, in doing so, they realize that they have to kind of keep their relationship under wraps, so they recruit the help of the writer that's been staying with Ben's grandfather to take him to this, seminar of sorts so they can meet the author and ask her questions of what to do. And in doing so, they uncover some information that they think they might need, and Ben kind of takes this information, takes it back home, and starts to put two and two together based on what he's seen and some context clues around the area, that the person who possibly is haunting the grounds may or may not be related to him. And unfortunately for Ben, it's made evident one day when the two are hanging out doing further research that the granddad catches them in the act, hanging out together. And the granddad kind of puts an ultimatum to Ben, saying, all right, I told you not to hang out with this girl, and now you force me, and give me no choice but to call your parents and tell them to come get you, and you're going to have to leave. And Ben is like, come on, I'll stop hanging out with her. You just got to trust me. And the granddad gives him one last chance to prove himself. But Ben, of course, being as stubborn as he is, he needs to help in this haunting for everyone. And he also still wants to be in Catherine's life. So it all comes down to a situation one night where things start to kind of build. The author that's staying with them, he thinks he hears something weird, and then randomly he disappears out of the plot. But Ben just so happens to spark some intrigue over at Catherine's house, and Catherine herself starts to tell her grandfather about Ben and how he's been helping her going through this ordeal, trying to find out who this woman is. And the granddad kind of drops a bombshell saying, I think I know who it is, and maybe I need to be a part of this. So Ben, Catherine, and Catherine's grandfather end up going to Ben's grandfather's estate, and Ben's grandfather gets involved, and they all head out to the backyard after they all think that they hear and see something back there, and then the grandfather has a harsh fall and possibly breaks his leg. But in doing so and being immobile, the ghost finally appears in front of everyone and pretty much has a huge bombshell to drop for not only the characters but the audience about who this character is, what happened to her, and how this plays a role with all the characters involved witnessing the spectacle. And the group may or may not take everything that this ghost is saying to heart, and we get to see what happens to the ghost and a possible change of heart with all the characters involved. And this wraps up in the ending where we see some characters kind of, wrap up in their arcs. We see the granddad kind of overcome him being dismissive of Ben and not wanting to talk about things and being kind of closed off and non-emotional. And then we see Ben and Catherine kind of go finish their arcs, with Ben kind of finding a place of belonging after the whole movie. Catherine kind of moving on from the grief of her parents. And then, of course, the learned things we learn about Catherine's grandfather, who he may or may not be holding on to some loss of a loved one, and that is causing him tremendous grief. And we even see potential workings of Ben's parents to kind of be involved in the situation, which leads to the very ending of the movie, where we see Catherine and Ben alone right before the credits roll, and there may or may not be a twist involving that there's possible more supernatural things afoot. And that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of the movie Believe. Now, Believe, I'm going to say this up front, starting with some positives with this movie, because I do have quite a few here. I think this movie is beautifully shot. Now, here's the thing about it. A lot of people that I would assume that have seen the trailers of this, or go watch the trailers before you watch the movie, or maybe if you look at this poster art, you're like, cool, what is this red demon thing coming out of this house, right? You may think that this movie's one big false advertisement, which it really is, and we'll get into that in the negatives. But this, you can't tell me that this movie isn't well made. And looking into it, this Avalanche Home Entertainment brand here, back in the day, used to make films for Lionsgate. If you don't know anything about Lionsgate, they kind of started out in the early days making movies for Showtime. And you'd be shocked by the filmography and the cinematography quality to this movie. For being essentially a low-budget film, the way the lighting looks and the camera angles hit, it feels dark, it feels in the moment, it feels lively, and it honestly just gives off that spooky atmosphere that honestly makes me reminiscent on ABC Family, 13 Nights of Halloween movies back in the day. And I'm shocked this movie wasn't a staple back then, because when you had movies like The Hollow and When Good Ghouls Go Bad and Casper Meets Wendy, which were all straight to video or TV movies, something like this would have been a shoo-in to play on the network. And I don't see why they never took the opportunity to lease this movie to show. I mean, and the fact that this movie got a PG-13 is kind of mind-boggling. This is one of those scenarios that, we see in modern kids' horror films like Zombie Town and Spirit Halloween the movie that get PG-13 ratings for really asinine reasons. This is another one of those. Throw that into the hat kind of movies. But that's honestly part of the charm to this movie, which I think this movie has a lot of heart and charm to it. Whether we're talking about the characters feeling organic and their chemistry together. And I have to really tip my hat to the writing of Ben and Catherine's friendship, and also the acting performances at times from Ricky Mabe, and especially from Alicia Cuthbert, who really brings the goods in this movie. They have an electric friendship, and that really helps carry the narrative of the movie. And it's one of these friendships that I kind of compare to like Zeke and Clarice from The Tale of the Dead Man's Float from Are You Afraid of the Dark? You just have that natural chemistry here it just really helps send the story with these two characters along the way for the audience. And I really appreciated that about the movie. The setting and the atmosphere, it felt really cold. It felt like fall. It's not quite a Halloween movie, but like I said, that spooky nature is throughout this movie. And there's something off and unsettling in that mystery that you want to get down to the bottom of. And honestly, some of my favorite parts in the movie aren't even around the mystery itself. It's around the antics and the revenge subplot that the movie goes down in the first half with Ben and Catherine trying to get back at these bullies. It felt very reminiscent to just original old school Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps stuff. And I really enjoyed that about the movie. That was probably my favorite part of the whole film. And yeah, looking at the themes, I think this movie has some very sound themes about holding on, resentment, and trying to find a place of belonging, and trying to put your best foot forward and move on from trauma or bad relationships or mending relationships, rebuilding bridges. There's a lot of those themes woven into this story, and all the characters have their own distinct arc, especially the characters we get to interact with, minus one, and we'll get into that in the negatives. But yeah, I thought that the character writing in this movie, we're not just talking about the two main characters of Ben and Catherine being good, it's pretty much the side characters as well. And you wouldn't think that, but I was pleasantly surprised with that. So yeah, very sound positives with the movie altogether. But now we got some negatives, and I'm going to bring up one of my most obvious ones here. I kind of already teased at it, but Ricky Mabe, his acting is very hit or miss within this movie. Sometimes he can be good and it feels authentic, and sometimes it just feels so melodramatic and weirdly delivered, especially when we're talking about his dialogue to Catherine and him kind of exposing his emotions about her and her situation. It just comes across so cheesy. I'm sorry, Ricky Mabe fans out there, but yeah, he could have done a little better in this movie. No offense, Ricky Mabe. I think you mostly did a good job here, but yeah, you were kind of cringy at points, and I'll just leave it at that. The second negative I have with this movie overall is there's a lot of points of the movie that just feel like they're in there to be in there for things to happen later in the plot, and then the plot just writes them away like they didn't matter, or they spend a lot of focus on areas or in the more slow parts of the plot that make the runtime feel way longer than it needs to be. And some examples of that is the whole author character being in the story. It's the guy who's staying at the grandfather's estate to write a book. I really don't get why he's in this movie, other than he plays a role later on to kind of help Ben and Catherine, but still, like, really? He kind of just straight up disappears from the plot, and in the back half of the movie up towards the quote-unquote climax of it. And yeah, I just really don't get why that inclusion needed to be in there. Which leads me to my second thing, right? This movie, I think it has a strong first half that kind of hooks you in, but once you get past the point, and you'll clearly notice this in the movie, once you get past the point of getting the revenge on Catherine's bullies, the movie really just hits a slog pace. And it starts to go down the mystery of this ghost woman that's in the backyard. And it's honestly just really bland, and nothing's happening for a good amount of that. It's a lot of just tension drama that just pad out the runtime and going back and forth between the will they, won't they thing with Ben and Catherine. On top of that, you have the grandfather constantly trying to threaten Ben and all this. And it's just unnecessary drama for the film, I guess, to build up the heartfelt conclusion that it has. But yeah, not my speed. Not my speed whatsoever. I nodded off quite a few times trying to finish this film. And I'm going to be honest. It took me around 15 rewind sessions to go back into certain points that I dozed off in, and majority of them were in the second half of the movie. So take that for what you will. Did not enjoy the second half as much as the first half. The ghost itself, the ghost, I guess the monster of the story, right? It, like I said earlier, it's like a sympathetic Are You Afraid of the Dark ghost story. So the ghost is a ghost of this woman, mild spoiler, and she looks kind of creepy from a distance, but there's certain shots in the movie that when you see her, you're like, how is this supposed to be scary? I'm sorry, y'all, but I get they're trying to be spooky and family friendly with the idea, but the makeup just looks so lazy on this woman. And I'm not trying to knock the actress who plays the ghost lady in this film, but good God almighty. You look at some of the stuff you see in the trailers, which mainly is like a false advertisement montage thing in the beginning of the movie. You see some effects there that have some promise, but then you get the actual ghost of the movie, and it just looks like what were they thinking? It's not that good. It could have been better on that front. I'll just leave it there as well. It's not much else to say about it other than just to be like, it's whatever. And getting down to the nitty gritty near the end of the movie, the climax is to be expected for this type of story. And like I said, all the Are You Afraid of the Dark sympathetic ghost story calling cards are all over this movie, so I kind of expected this direction for the climax. But the climax isn't really eventful, as it is more of just like all this tension builds up to these characters to finally interact with this ghost. And it turns out to be like a pep talk kind of thing, and like, okay. Like I said, very ABC Family, DCOM-ish style of being family-friendly horror, and yeah, not my speed, but I guess it's fine, but I really didn't get much enjoyment out of that climax reveal thing. So, take that for what you will. Which leads me to the ending of the movie. I feel like some things that happen with certain characters, even though they do feel earned, within the last 5 minutes, they try to go down the cliche route of families that have been estranged are now magically together because of the events of a climax. And I feel like there's a lot of unanswered things that I kind of want answered, ironically, that just feel like they're not being answered. And to add further frustration to that, the will they, won't they ship that Ben and Catherine have been going through the whole movie, it doesn't really feel like they got to a point where they get to potentially be a couple, even though that Ben kind of openly calls himself like a boyfriend figure to this girl Catherine in the movie throughout many times, and she clearly is like really into him. You never really get to see them have that romantic moment in that cliche way, and I'm just thinking, if you're going to throw every cliche at the ending, why not at least throw this one out there and make a love ship, kiss scene or something. But no, you go this goofy twist angle, which I wasn't really expecting, to be honest, and I didn't remember that from the first time I watched it, and it kind of made me low-key cringe as the movie faded to the credit sequence. It was just like, okay, that was that, I guess. Which honestly is a good way to exemplify how I feel about this movie at the end of the day. With all those negatives and all those positives being said, did I enjoy this movie for what it was? Yes. I mean, I enjoy it pretty much in the same vein as I enjoy an average Are You Afraid of the Dark sympathetic ghost story episode. But I ironically think that the concept of a sympathetic ghost story can work in a full movie. While this movie did have a semblance of that pretty much throughout, the best parts were the first half, where that stuff really wasn't all that important, sadly. And for me, because it has such a fun first half, it will score way higher than if the whole movie was just what the second half was, which would have been more detrimental for me. Honestly, the emotions in here are pretty much way better done than your average Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, so take that for what you will. And I think that I much rather would watch this over majority of those episodes, even those are only like 22 to 25 minutes. There's something about this movie that it just gets the idea a little better there, and is a little bit more dynamic. But it does have its ailments. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, since I enjoyed it pretty reasonably, that usually scores a minimum of a 3.3 or higher, which is getting into that okay territory or higher. And the highest you can be is like perfect. But for me, I came out finding that this movie was pretty decent. It's not the greatest thing ever. It has some huge flaws. So a decent for me is about a 3.5 to a 3.6. And I decided to be nicer on this movie and give it about a 3.6 out of 5 stars. It's a C- of a movie, especially for kids' horror standards. I think it's underrated and definitely overlooked. And like I said earlier, I'm shocked that nobody has made a review of this film on YouTube. And I strongly urge you guys to go check it out, especially if you're fans of classic Are You Afraid of the Dark. This will itch a scratch for you. And you have familiar Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark alum in the movie that also kind of make it cool in that meta way. And there's also some side character performances that you'll see in this movie, played by actors you might recognize throughout Kids Horror. I don't want to spoil that for you. I want you to go in blind so you can enjoy those things when you see it. But yeah, that in a nutshell is my thoughts on Believe. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this movie before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.